Sarah Martinez had always been good with her hands. Growing up in a small town near Camp Pendleton, she watched military families come and go, their lives constantly shifting like the California tides. At 24, she owned a modest hair salon called Seaside Cuts just outside the base gates. To most people, she was simply the friendly hairdresser who gave great cuts and listened to their problems. But Sarah carried secrets that would surprise even her closest customers. Before opening her salon, she had spent 3 years as a Navy hospital corpsman, trained in advanced trauma medicine and combat first aid. Her father, a retired Marine Corps sergeant, had taught her to shoot when she was 12. Her older brother Marcus served as a communications specialist with the SEALs, and through him, she had learned more about military operations than most civilians ever would. The decision to leave military service hadn't been easy. After losing 2 patients during a particularly brutal deployment in Afghanistan, Sarah found herself struggling with nightmares and anxiety. The doctors called it PTSD, but Sarah simply called it being tired of seeing good people die. She wanted a quiet life, cutting hair and making people feel beautiful instead of patching up their wounds. Her salon became a sanctuary for military families. Wives would bring their children for haircuts while their husbands deployed overseas. Sarah learned to comfort crying toddlers who missed their fathers and wives, who worried about empty chairs at dinner tables. She kept her medical training quiet, though she had helped with a few minor emergencies over the years. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday. Sarah arrived at her salon at 7 in the morning, the familiar scent of hair products and the soft hum of fluorescent lights greeting her. She had 4 appointments scheduled, including Mrs. Henderson, the colonel's wife who always requested the same bob cut she had worn for 20 years. As she prepared her station, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Usually, her brother's messages were brief updates about his latest training exercises or complaints about military food. This message was different. It contained only coordinates and a single word: compromised. Sarah's blood ran cold. Marcus had taught her this emergency code years ago, back when she first enlisted. It meant his team was in serious trouble, cut off from normal communication channels and needed help that couldn't come through official military channels. The coordinates pointed to a location about 30 miles inland, in the rugged hills where the SEALs often conducted training exercises. She stared at the message for several minutes, her hands trembling slightly. This was exactly the kind of situation she had left the military to avoid. She had built a peaceful life, far from the chaos and violence that had once consumed her days. Her customers trusted her to be there, to provide the stability and normalcy that military life so often lacked. But Marcus was her only family left. Their parents had died in a car accident 3 years earlier, leaving just the 2 siblings to look out for each other. Despite choosing different paths, they had always been there when the other needed help. Sarah remembered the night Marcus had driven 8 hours to be with her when she was hospitalized after a panic attack, following her discharge. She tried calling him, but the phone went straight to voicemail. She sent a text asking for more information but received no response. The coordinates burned in her memory, and she found herself calculating driving time and considering what supplies she might need. At 8:30, Mrs. Henderson arrived for her appointment. Chatting about her garden and the new restaurant that had opened downtown, Sarah went through the motions of washing, cutting, and styling hair, but her mind kept drifting to the message. She made small talk and smiled at the appropriate moments, but inside she was planning. After Mrs. Henderson left, Sarah locked the front door and flipped the sign to closed. She had never closed the salon without notice before, but this felt like an emergency. Her brother wouldn't contact her this way unless lives were at stake. She quickly called her remaining appointments and rescheduled them for the following week, claiming a family emergency. In the back room of her salon, Sarah opened a storage closet that her customers had never seen. Behind boxes of hair color and extra towels, she kept a military-grade first aid kit, the kind used by combat medics. She also had a small firearm safe containing her father's service pistol and her own Glock 19, both properly licensed and maintained. Sarah changed out of her salon clothes and into dark jeans, hiking boots, and a black t-shirt. She filled a backpack with medical supplies, water, energy bars, and a tactical flashlight. The familiar weight of the pistol on her hip felt strange after months of civilian life, but muscle memory took over as she checked the magazine and holstered the weapon. Before leaving, She sent a single text to her assistant, telling her to cancel appointments for the rest of the week due to a family emergency. Then she turned off her phone, knowing that whatever was happening with Marcus's team, electronic communications were likely compromised. As Sarah drove toward the coordinates, her mind raced through possibilities. SEAL teams were some of the most elite warriors in the world, trained to handle impossible situations. If they were calling for help outside normal channels, something had gone very wrong. She thought about the skills she had learned as a corpsman, and wondered if they would be enough. The GPS led her away from the coastal highways and into the hills where cell phone service became spotty. Sarah had driven these roads before during her military days, but never on a mission like this. She passed familiar landmarks and remembered training exercises where she had patched up injured Marines in similar terrain. As the coordinates drew closer, Sarah began to understand why Marcus had contacted her. This area was remote enough that a team could operate without civilian interference, but close enough to the base that they could call for backup if needed. If they were cut off from normal support, they would need someone who could reach them quickly and had the skills to help. Sarah parked her car about a mile from the coordinates, hidden behind a cluster of rocks where it wouldn't be visible from the road. She shouldered her backpack and began hiking toward whatever situation had made her brother desperate enough to risk exposing her location to his teammates. The afternoon sun beat down on the dusty hills, and Sarah felt the familiar mix of fear and determination that had once defined her military service. The terrain grew rougher as Sarah approached the coordinates. Rocky outcroppings and thick brush made for slow going, and she found herself grateful for the conditioning she maintained through daily runs along the beach. The afternoon heat was building and sweat beaded on her forehead as she navigated the increasingly difficult path. About half a mile from the target location, Sarah heard the first gunshot. The sharp crack echoed off the canyon walls, followed by a rapid series of automatic weapons fire. She dropped to a crouch behind a large boulder, her heart pounding as the sounds of combat filled the air. This wasn't a training exercise gone wrong. This was a real firefight. Sarah pulled out a small pair of binoculars she had brought and carefully scanned the area ahead. Through the scope, she could see what appeared to be an old mining operation built into the hillside. Concrete structures and metal buildings dotted the landscape, providing plenty of cover for both attackers and defenders. Muzzle flashes sparked from multiple positions, and she could see figures moving between the buildings. The tactical situation became clearer as Sarah observed the battle. A group of what appeared to be heavily armed men had surrounded a smaller concrete building near the center of the complex. They were firing into the structure from multiple angles, effectively pinning down whoever was inside. The building looked like it might have been an old equipment storage facility, with thick walls that could provide good protection but limited escape routes. Sarah's military training kicked in as she assessed the situation. The attacking force seemed to have at least 8 to 10 men, all carrying military-style weapons and moving with the coordination of trained soldiers. They had established overlapping fields of fire and were systematically working to flush out their targets. This wasn't a random encounter. It was a professional operation. She worked her way closer using the terrain and abandoned mining equipment for cover. The sound of gunfire was almost constant now, punctuated by shouted commands in what sounded like a foreign language. As she got within about 200 yards of the complex, Sarah could finally see the tactical situation clearly. Marcus and what appeared to be 3 other SEALs were trapped inside the concrete building. She could see them through a broken window, taking turns returning fire while one of them worked frantically on what looked like communications equipment. One of the SEALs appeared to be wounded, lying against the back wall while another applied pressure to what looked like a leg wound. The attacking force had positioned themselves expertly. They controlled the high ground on 3 sides of the building, and their crossfire made it impossible for the SEALs to attempt an escape. Even worse, Sarah could see movement in the distance that suggested more attackers were moving into position to complete the encirclement. Sarah recognized the tactical problem immediately. The SEALs were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in a position with no good escape routes. Their communications were obviously compromised, or they would have called for backup through normal channels. Time was running out, and without intervention, this situation would end badly. She studied the terrain around the complex, looking for advantages. The old mining operation had been built on multiple levels, with roads and paths connecting different areas. Most of the attacking force was focused on the building where the SEALs were trapped, but they had positioned sentries to watch the approaches. Sarah counted at least 3 guard positions that would need to be neutralized before she could reach her brother's team. The closest sentry was about 50 yards away, positioned behind an overturned mining cart with a clear view of the main approach to the complex. He carried an assault rifle and was scanning the area methodically. Sarah watched his pattern for several minutes, noting that he focused most of his attention on the area where vehicles might approach from the main road. Sarah checked her equipment one more time. She had her pistol, the medical kit, water, and emergency supplies. Against a force this size, direct confrontation wasn't an option. She would need to use stealth, surprise, and the terrain to her advantage. Most importantly, she would need to create enough confusion to give the SEALs an opportunity to escape or call for backup. The plan that formed in Sarah's mind was risky, but it was better than watching her brother and his teammates die in that concrete building. She would work her way around to the far side of the complex, away from the main concentration of attackers. From there, she could try to eliminate the sentries one by one and create an escape route for the SEALs. Sarah began moving carefully through the brush, staying low and using every available piece of cover. The sound of gunfire helped mask any noise she might make, but she knew that one mistake would alert the entire attacking force to her presence. She thought about the hundreds of hours of training she had received in combat medicine and basic tactics, never imagining she would need those skills to save her own brother. As she worked her way toward the first sentry position, Sarah could hear radio chatter from the attackers. They were speaking in heavily accented English, coordinating their assault on the building. From what she could understand, they planned to use explosives to breach the walls within the next few minutes. Time was running out. The first sentry was focused on the valley below, watching for approaching vehicles or reinforcements. Sarah managed to get within 30 feet of his position before he began to turn in her direction. She froze behind a rusted piece of mining equipment, holding her breath as the man's eyes swept past her hiding spot. Sarah realized that she was about to cross a line she had hoped never to cross again. In her medical training, she had taken an oath to do no harm, to save lives rather than take them. But the men firing on her brother and his teammates weren't offering that luxury. They were professionals who had come here to kill, and they wouldn't hesitate to kill her if they discovered her presence. When the sentry turned back toward the valley, Sarah made her move. Years of training and muscle memory took over as she approached silently from behind. The technique was swift and silent, learned during her combat medical training for situations where medics needed to protect their patients. The sentry collapsed without making a sound. Sarah quickly dragged the body behind the mining cart and picked up his radio. The chatter was more urgent now, with someone giving orders about preparing charges for the final assault. She estimated that she had maybe 10 minutes before they would blow a hole in the concrete building and finish off the SEALs inside. Moving to the next sentry position, Sarah felt the familiar mix of fear and focus that had once defined her combat deployments. But this time was different. This time she wasn't just trying to save strangers in a foreign country. This time she was fighting to save the only family she had left. The comfortable life she had built at the salon felt like a distant memory as she prepared to face the second guard. The second sentry proved more challenging. He was positioned on higher ground with a better view of the surrounding area, and he seemed more alert than his companion. Sarah spent precious minutes studying his movements, looking for a pattern or blind spot she could exploit. Every second that passed brought the SEALs closer to the final assault. From her new position, Sarah could see into the concrete building where Marcus and his team were trapped. The wounded SEAL was still conscious, but she could see blood pooling on the floor despite the efforts of his teammate to stop the bleeding. Marcus was at the window, returning fire in controlled bursts while trying to preserve ammunition. The fourth team member was still working desperately on their communications equipment. Sarah heard a new voice on the radio she had taken from the first sentry. The tone was different, more authoritative and urgent. Someone was giving final orders, coordinating the explosive charges that would end this standoff. She estimated 5 minutes, maybe less, before they would blast their way into the building. The second sentry shifted his position, moving to get a better angle on something in the valley below. Sarah saw her opportunity and took it. This time, the approach was more difficult due to the rocky terrain, but her medical training had included instruction in moving silently through combat zones. She thought of all the wounded soldiers she had reached under fire, using similar techniques to stay alive while saving others. With the second guard neutralized, Sarah had a clearer view of the entire complex. The main assault force consisted of 7 men positioned around the concrete building, with the leader coordinating from behind an overturned truck about 100 yards away. They had set up a devastating crossfire that made escape impossible for the trapped SEALs. Sarah realized that taking out sentries wouldn't be enough. The main assault force was too large and too well positioned for her to handle alone. She needed a different approach, something that would create enough chaos and confusion to give the SEALs a fighting chance to escape or turn the tables on their attackers. Looking around the mining complex, Sarah spotted something that might work. An old fuel storage tank sat on a hill overlooking the battle. It appeared to be empty and abandoned, but she could see staining on the ground around it that suggested it might still contain some residual fuel. If she could somehow rupture that tank and ignite it, the explosion would be visible for miles and might serve as a signal to bring help. More importantly, the tank was positioned perfectly to create a diversion. An explosion there would force the attackers to divide their attention and might give the SEALs the opportunity they needed to break out of their trap. It was risky, but Sarah couldn't think of any other options with the time remaining. Sarah began working her way toward the fuel tank, moving carefully through the maze of abandoned mining equipment. The climb was steep and exposed, making her vulnerable if any of the attackers happened to look in her direction. She could hear the radio chatter becoming more urgent as the assault team prepared for their final push. Halfway to the tank, Sarah heard Marcus's voice for the first time since arriving. He was calling out tactical information to his team, coordinating their defense with the calm professionalism she remembered from their childhood. Even in this desperate situation, he sounded like the big brother who had taught her to ride a bike and helped her with math homework. The thought of losing Marcus drove Sarah to move faster. She had already lost her parents in that car accident 3 years ago. She couldn't bear the thought of being alone in the world, of having no family left to share memories and holidays with. The salon and her civilian life felt meaningless compared to saving the only person who truly understood where she came from. As Sarah reached the fuel tank, she could see that it was indeed still partially full. The metal was corroded in several places, and she could smell the distinct odor of diesel fuel. This would definitely explode if she could find a way to ignite it. The challenge was creating enough damage to rupture the tank and then getting clear before the explosion. Sarah checked her supplies and found a small emergency flare in her medical kit. It wasn't much, but it might be enough if she could create the right conditions. She also had a small folding knife that might be useful for puncturing the tank wall in a strategic location. Working quickly, Sarah used the knife to create a small hole in the side of the tank facing the battle below. Diesel fuel began to leak out, creating a puddle that spread downhill toward the combat zone. She then worked to create several larger holes, allowing more fuel to escape and form a trail that could carry fire back to the main tank. The radio chatter reached a crescendo as the assault team leader gave what sounded like final orders. Sarah could see men moving toward the concrete building with what appeared to be explosive charges. She was running out of time, but the fuel trail wasn't long enough yet to guarantee ignition of the main tank. Sarah made a desperate decision. She emptied her water bottles and began using them to extend the fuel trail, creating a longer path that would ensure the fire reached the tank. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. She could hear the assault team shouting final warnings to the SEALs, giving them one last chance to surrender. Marcus's response was exactly what Sarah expected from her stubborn older brother. His answer was delivered in the form of gunfire, and the final battle for the concrete building began. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from multiple directions as the attackers closed in for the kill. Sarah lit the emergency flare and touched it to the beginning of the fuel trail. The flame caught immediately, racing along the diesel-soaked ground toward the tank. She turned and ran, trying to get as much distance as possible before the explosion. The blast was bigger than Sarah had expected. The fuel tank exploded with a thunderous roar that echoed across the entire valley, sending a column of fire and smoke hundreds of feet into the air. The shockwave knocked Sarah to the ground, and debris rained down around her as she covered her head and waited for the chaos to subside. When Sarah looked up, she could see that her plan had worked better than she had hoped. The explosion had created a massive distraction, and several of the attackers were looking toward the fire instead of maintaining their positions around the building. More importantly, The smoke was rising high enough that it would be visible from the military base, potentially bringing help. But the immediate tactical situation was still desperate. The assault team leader was shouting orders, trying to regain control of his men and refocus them on the mission. Sarah could see that some of the attackers were already turning back toward the concrete building, preparing to finish what they had started despite the distraction. The explosion had created exactly the distraction Sarah hoped for, but she realized it might not be enough. While the attackers were momentarily confused by the blast and the towering column of smoke, their leader was already reorganizing them to continue the assault. Sarah watched as he gestured angrily at his men, pointing them back toward the concrete building where Marcus and his team remained trapped. Sarah knew she had to act fast while the chaos provided cover. The explosion had given her brother's team a brief respite, but it wouldn't last long. She could see Marcus and another SEAL using the distraction to reposition themselves within the building, trying to find better defensive positions for the final assault they knew was coming. Moving quickly through the smoke and confusion, Sarah worked her way closer to the main battle. The burning fuel tank continued to pour black smoke into the sky, creating a signal that should be visible from the military base 30 miles away. But even if help was coming, it would take time to arrive, and the SEALs didn't have time. From her new position, Sarah could see the tactical situation more clearly. The assault team had been reduced to 6 men after the confusion of the explosion, with their leader trying to coordinate a final push on the building. They had prepared explosive charges that would breach the concrete walls, and Sarah could see them preparing to move into position to plant the devices. Sarah realized that her best opportunity would come when the attackers focused on placing the charges. They would have to expose themselves to get close enough to the building, and that exposure might give her a chance to even the odds. She checked her pistol and counted her ammunition, enough for a short firefight, but she would have to make every shot count. The wounded SEAL inside the building was in bad condition. Even from her distant position, Sarah could see that he was losing blood and needed immediate medical attention. Her medical training told her that without proper treatment soon, he wouldn't survive much longer. The knowledge that she might be able to save him added urgency to her mission. Sarah watched the assault team leader give final instructions to his men. 2 of them would approach the building from opposite sides to plant the charges, while the others provided covering fire. It was a sound tactical plan that would be difficult to counter from inside the building. But Sarah's position outside their perimeter gave her options they hadn't considered. As the 2 men began their approach to plant the explosives, Sarah made her move. She had positioned herself where she could engage both targets, though it would require quick and accurate shooting. Years of training with her father and regular practice at the shooting range had prepared her for this moment, though she had never imagined using those skills in combat. Sarah's first shot took down the attacker approaching the left side of the building. The man dropped the explosive charge and fell, clutching his shoulder. Her second shot missed the other attacker, but forced him to dive for cover behind a piece of mining equipment, abandoning his approach to the building. The sudden gunfire from an unexpected direction threw the assault team into confusion. Their leader was shouting into his radio, trying to determine where the new threat was coming from. Sarah could hear him demanding to know what had happened to his sentries, beginning to realize that their carefully planned operation was falling apart. Marcus's voice rang out from inside the building, calling tactical information to his team. Sarah could hear the surprise and hope in his voice as he realized that someone was attacking their attackers from behind. The SEALs immediately took advantage of the confusion, increasing their rate of fire and forcing the assault team to take defensive positions. Sarah kept moving, using the smoke from the burning fuel tank and the rocky terrain to stay ahead of the attackers who were now searching for her. She could hear them coordinating on their radios, trying to locate and eliminate this new threat that had disrupted their mission. But their communications discipline was breaking down as the operation spiraled out of control. The tactical situation had completely reversed. Instead of being the hunters closing in on trapped prey, the assault team now found themselves caught between the SEALs in the building and an unknown sniper in the hills. Their leader was screaming orders, but his men were more focused on finding cover than following his instructions. Sarah's next opportunity came when 3 of the attackers tried to flank her position. They moved in a coordinated formation, but they were operating in unfamiliar terrain while Sarah had spent the last hour learning every rock and hiding place in the area. She was able to position herself where she could engage them from a concealed position. The firefight was brief but intense. Sarah's medical training had included instruction in combat situations, and she found herself falling back on lessons about staying calm under fire and making quick tactical decisions. She wounded one attacker and forced the other two to retreat, further reducing the assault team's effectiveness. Inside the building, the SEALs were taking advantage of the chaos to improve their situation. Sarah could see them repositioning to cover different approaches and working to establish communication with their base. The wounded man was still conscious, though she could see that his condition was deteriorating. Sarah realized that she needed to get closer to assess the medical situation. The wounded SEAL needed immediate attention, and she was the only person in the area with the training to provide it. But reaching the building meant crossing open ground under fire from the remaining attackers. The assault team leader made one final attempt to salvage his mission. He gathered his remaining men and prepared for a desperate rush on the building, hoping to overwhelm the defenders through sheer aggression. Sarah could see them preparing for the charge, knowing that this would be the decisive moment of the battle. As the attackers began their final assault, Sarah made a decision that would have seemed impossible to her just hours earlier, when she was cutting hair in her peaceful salon. She left her concealed position and began running toward the concrete building, firing as she moved and shouting to let Marcus know she was coming. The sight of a lone figure charging across the open ground caught everyone by surprise. The attackers split their fire between Sarah and the building, reducing the pressure on both targets. Marcus and his team responded by increasing their defensive fire, creating a crossfire that the assault team couldn't handle. Sarah reached the building just as the last of the attackers broke and ran. She could hear vehicles starting in the distance as the survivors abandoned their mission and fled the area. The smoke from the burning fuel tank continued to rise into the sky, and she could hear the distant sound of helicopters approaching from the direction of the military base. Marcus appeared in the doorway of the building, his face showing a mixture of relief, amazement, and concern. "Sarah, what the hell are you doing here?" he asked, though his tone suggested he was more grateful than angry. Behind him, Sarah could see his teammates and the wounded man who needed her immediate attention. "I got your message," Sarah replied simply, already moving toward the injured SEAL with her medical kit. "Now let me help your friend before we both have a lot of explaining to do." Sarah knelt beside the wounded SEAL, her civilian clothes and long hair creating a surreal contrast to the military environment around her. The man was conscious but pale, with a bullet wound in his upper thigh that had been bleeding steadily despite the pressure bandage his teammate had applied. Sarah's medical training kicked in immediately as she assessed the injury. "What's your name?" she asked the wounded man while opening her medical kit. "Petty Officer Rodriguez," he replied through gritted teeth. "And you're supposed to be a hairdresser, right?" Sarah smiled grimly as she cut away the makeshift bandage to examine the wound more closely. "I am a hairdresser. I'm also a former Navy corpsman. Lucky for you, I never forgot my training." The bullet had passed through the muscle without hitting the bone or major arteries, but Rodriguez was losing blood faster than was safe. Marcus watched his sister work with professional efficiency, applying a new pressure bandage and starting an IV line from her medical kit. "Sarah, how did you even know we were here?" "Our communications have been jammed for the last 6 hours. You sent me coordinates and said you were compromised," Sarah replied, not looking up from her patient. "I figured you wouldn't risk exposing my location unless you really needed help." She worked quickly to stabilize Rodriguez's condition, monitoring his pulse and blood pressure while ensuring the bleeding was controlled. The other two SEALs introduced themselves as Chief Petty Officer James Thompson and Petty Officer First Class Mike. Chen Thompson was the team leader, a veteran operator with 15 years of experience who looked like he had seen everything the military could throw at him, until today, when his team's training exercise had turned into a real-world crisis. "Ma'am, I don't know how you found us or how you learned to fight like that, but you saved our lives," Thompson said. "Rodriguez would have bled out before the cavalry arrived, and they had us pinned down with no way out." Chen was working on their communications equipment, trying to re-establish contact with their command center. "I'm getting signals again," he reported. "Whatever was jamming us seems to have stopped when those guys retreated." Sarah continued monitoring Rodriguez, while the sound of approaching helicopters grew louder. "Chief, your man is stable, but he needs a proper medical facility. That bullet did more damage than it looks like from the outside, and he's going to need surgery to repair the muscle damage." Marcus sat down beside his sister, still trying to process what had just happened. Sarah, where did you learn to shoot like that? Dad taught us both, but what you did out there was combat-level marksmanship. I never stopped practicing after I got out, Sarah admitted. I guess I always knew that my past might catch up with me somehow. I just never thought it would be like this. Thompson was coordinating with the incoming helicopters on his radio, providing landing coordinates and casualty reports. Sarah could hear him explaining the situation to someone at the command center, though he was being careful not to mention too many details about the civilian who had intervened in their operation. The thing is, Marcus continued, this wasn't supposed to be a combat situation. We were conducting a routine training exercise when we stumbled into something that definitely wasn't routine. Those guys who attacked us weren't random hostiles. They were professionals with military-grade equipment and training. Sarah looked up from her patient. What kind of training exercise involves getting trapped in an abandoned mining complex with no communications? Chen answered from his position at the radio. We were practicing infiltration and reconnaissance in unfamiliar terrain. The scenario was supposed to be a simple observation mission, but when we reached our target coordinates, we found that mining complex occupied by people who definitely weren't supposed to be there. We tried to withdraw when we realized we had stumbled into something real, Thompson added, but they had sentries posted who spotted us. Before we knew it, we were pinned down and our communications were being jammed. Those weren't random criminals. They were operating with military precision and coordination. Sarah considered this information while checking Rodriguez's vital signs again. So you accidentally discovered some kind of illegal operation, and they decided to eliminate you rather than risk exposure. That's what it looks like, Marcus agreed. The question is what they were doing up here that was worth killing 4 SEALs to protect. The first helicopter appeared over the ridge, a medical evacuation bird that would transport Rodriguez to the base hospital. Sarah began preparing her patient for transport, ensuring his IV was secure and his bandages would hold during the flight. She had performed this routine dozens of times during her military service, though never on her brother's teammate. As the helicopter landed, raising clouds of dust and debris, Sarah found herself thinking about the decision she had made to close her salon and drive into the hills. Just that morning, her biggest concern had been Mrs. Henderson's haircut and whether she had enough inventory for the week. Now she was treating combat casualties and trying to explain how a civilian had single-handedly disrupted a professional military operation. The helicopter crew included a Navy corpsman who immediately took over Rodriguez's care. Sarah briefed him on the injuries and treatment she had provided, using the medical terminology and procedures that felt both familiar and strange after her years in civilian life. The corpsman nodded approvingly at her work, recognizing professional-level trauma care. You did good work here, he told Sarah as they loaded Rodriguez onto the stretcher. This man would have been in serious trouble without immediate medical attention. Rodriguez gripped Sarah's hand as they prepared to load him into the helicopter. Thank you, he said simply. I owe you my life. As the medical helicopter lifted off, 2 more aircraft approached the landing zone. These were transport helicopters carrying what appeared to be a full investigative team, including military intelligence officers and crime scene specialists. Sarah realized that her involvement in the situation was far from over. Thompson and Marcus were huddled together, discussing how to explain the civilian presence at what was clearly going to become a classified investigation. Sarah understood their dilemma. Her actions had saved their lives, but her presence complicated an already unusual situation. Chief, Sarah said, approaching the 2 men. I understand this is going to be complicated to explain. If it would be easier, I can disappear before your people arrive and we can pretend this never happened. Thompson shook his head firmly. Ma'am, you saved 4 American lives today and helped prevent whatever operation those people were running from continuing. There's no way we're going to pretend you weren't here. We'll figure out the paperwork later. Marcus put his arm around his sister's shoulders. Besides, I'm not letting you disappear after what just happened. We need to talk about how you learned to fight like that, and why you've been keeping those skills a secret. Sarah looked around at the abandoned mining complex, the smoke still rising from the burning fuel tank, and the approaching helicopters full of investigators. Her quiet life as a small-town hairdresser suddenly seemed very far away. The next 3 hours passed in a blur of debriefings, investigators, and questions that Sarah had never expected to answer again. The military intelligence team that arrived on the second wave of helicopters treated her with a mixture of respect and suspicion, clearly struggling to understand how a civilian hairdresser had managed to single-handedly rescue an elite SEAL team. Major Patricia Williams, the lead intelligence officer, conducted Sarah's interview with the methodical precision of someone who had seen unusual situations before. She was a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and the kind of presence that commanded respect without saying a word. Sarah found herself appreciating the Major's direct approach after years of dealing with military bureaucracy. "Ms. Martinez, I need you to walk me through exactly how you received the distress signal and what made you decide to respond personally rather than contacting authorities," Major Williams began, her pen poised over a notepad that Sarah suspected would become part of a classified file. Sarah explained about Marcus's coded message and her decision to investigate when she couldn't reach him through normal channels. She was careful to be completely honest about her military background and the skills she had maintained since leaving service, knowing that any deception would be discovered quickly by investigators of this caliber. "Your medical treatment of Petty Officer Rodriguez was exemplary," the Major continued. "The base surgeon confirmed that your field treatment likely saved his life and prevented permanent disability. Where did you acquire combat medical training of that level?" 3 years as a Navy corpsman, including 2 deployments to Afghanistan," Sarah replied. "I served primarily with Marine units in forward operating bases where combat medicine was a daily requirement." Major Williams consulted her notes, clearly having already verified Sarah's service record. "Your discharge was medical, related to post-traumatic stress. Have you received any training or engaged in any activities since your discharge that would explain your tactical performance today?" Sarah considered her answer carefully. "I maintained my marksmanship skills through regular practice, and I've stayed in good physical condition. But honestly, Major, I was running on adrenaline and instinct out there. I saw my brother in trouble and my training took over." While Sarah was being interviewed, the investigation team was examining the mining complex and trying to piece together what the attackers had been doing there. Thompson and Chen were providing their own statements about how their routine training exercise had turned into a deadly encounter with unknown hostiles. Marcus waited outside the interview tent, pacing nervously and clearly worried about his sister's situation. Despite his years of military service, he had never been involved in an incident that required this level of investigation. The fact that Sarah had saved his life didn't change the complicated questions about how a civilian had become involved in what was clearly a classified situation. After 2 hours of interviews, Major Williams emerged from the tent looking thoughtful. She approached Marcus with the expression of someone who was about to deliver news that nobody would particularly like. "Your sister's story checks out completely," she told Marcus. "Her military record shows exactly the kind of training that would explain her actions today, and her discharge was honorable with commendations for her medical service. The problem is what we discovered in that mining complex." Sarah joined them as Major Williams continued her briefing. "The investigation team found evidence of a sophisticated drug processing operation that was using the abandoned mining infrastructure as cover. We're talking about equipment worth millions of dollars and the capacity to produce enormous quantities of synthetic narcotics for distribution throughout the region. So, we accidentally stumbled into a major drug operation during our training exercise?" Marcus asked. "It appears so. The people who attacked you were professional security personnel hired to protect that operation. When your team discovered their location, they made the decision to eliminate you rather than risk exposure." Sarah felt a chill as she realized how close Marcus and his team had come to dying simply because they had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. "How long had they been operating there?" "Based on the infrastructure we found, probably at least 6 months, Major Williams replied. "This was a major operation that was completely off our radar until your brother's team accidentally discovered it." The Major paused, clearly choosing her words carefully. "Which brings us to the complicated question of what happens next. Ms. Martinez, your actions today were heroic and potentially saved 4 lives. However, you're now a civilian witness to a classified military operation who also happens to possess combat skills that enabled you to neutralize multiple armed hostiles." Sarah understood the implications immediately. Her involvement in this situation had created complications that would require careful handling by people with security clearances and authority levels far above a small-town hairdresser. What exactly are you saying, Major? Sarah asked. I'm saying that this incident is going to require a significant amount of paperwork and coordination between multiple agencies. The drug operation you helped uncover is now the subject of a joint investigation involving the DEA, FBI, and military intelligence. Your role in today's events makes you a valuable witness, but also someone who has been exposed to classified information. Marcus stepped closer to his sister, his protective instincts clearly activated. Major Williams, my sister was just trying to help when she received my distress signal. She shouldn't be penalized for saving our lives. She's not being penalized, Petty Officer Martinez, but she is going to need to sign some non-disclosure agreements and may be called upon to provide additional testimony as the investigation proceeds. Sarah nodded, understanding that this was the price of her decision to leave her salon and drive into the hills. I understand, Major. I knew there would be consequences when I decided to respond to Marcus's message. Major Williams studied Sarah for a moment, as if making some kind of assessment. Ms. Martinez, there's one more thing we need to discuss. Your performance today was exceptional, not just medically but tactically. You demonstrated skills and decision-making ability that are rare even among professional operators. I just did what needed to be done to help my brother. I understand that. But I'm curious. Have you given any thought to returning to military service? Your record shows that you left due to medical issues that appear to have been successfully treated. The military has programs for bringing back personnel with your experience and skills. Sarah looked at Marcus, who was clearly surprised by the suggestion. The idea of returning to military life was something she had never seriously considered since her discharge. Her salon, her customers, her quiet civilian life. All of that had been built specifically to escape the chaos and violence that had driven her to leave the military in the first place. I appreciate the suggestion, Major, but I've built a life as a civilian. I have a business, customers who depend on me, and I've worked hard to find peace after my experiences overseas. Major Williams nodded respectfully. I understand, but I want you to know that if you ever reconsider, there are people who would be very interested in talking with you about opportunities that would make good use of your unique combination of skills. As the investigation team began packing up their equipment, Sarah realized that her life had changed irrevocably in the space of a single afternoon. Even if she returned to her salon tomorrow and tried to resume her normal routine, she would never be just a hairdresser again. Today had reminded her that she possessed skills and training that could make a real difference in life and death situations. 6 months later, Sarah was trimming Mrs. Henderson's hair when the bell above her salon door chimed. She looked up to see Rodriguez walking in, moving with only a slight limp that was barely noticeable unless you knew what to look for. His recovery had been remarkable, and Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction knowing that her field treatment had contributed to his complete healing. Hope you have time for a walk-in, Rodriguez said with a grin. I'm getting married next week, and my fiancé insisted I get a proper haircut from the woman who saved my life. Sarah smiled, setting down her scissors to give him a hug. Congratulations. And of course I have time. Mrs. Henderson, this is the patient I told you about. Mrs. Henderson beamed at Rodriguez with the kind of maternal pride that military wives developed for all service members. You look wonderful, young man. Sarah talks about you boys all the time. It was true. The events at the mining complex had become a regular topic of conversation at the salon, though Sarah was careful to keep the details vague due to the non-disclosure agreements she had signed. Her customers knew that she had helped rescue some soldiers, and that was enough to make her something of a local hero. As Sarah worked on Rodriguez's haircut, he updated her on the investigation's aftermath. The drug operation they had uncovered had been part of a much larger network that stretched across 3 states. The arrests and seizures that followed had been significant enough to earn commendations for everyone involved, including Sarah, though her award ceremony had been private due to the classified nature of the operation. Thompson is getting promoted to senior chief, Rodriguez mentioned. He says it's partly because of how he handled the situation at the mining complex. Chen is being transferred to a training position where he can share some of the lessons learned from our experience. And Marcus? Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer from their weekly phone calls. Your brother is being considered for advanced training that could lead to a leadership position. Apparently having a sister who can single-handedly rescue a SEAL team is considered a valuable family trait. Sarah laughed. remembering the endless teasing Marcus had endured from his teammates about being saved by his hairdresser sister. "I'm sure he loves all the attention." Mrs. Henderson, who had been listening with obvious fascination, spoke up. "Sarah, I still can't believe you kept all that training secret for so long. All those times you helped with little emergencies around here. And we never knew you were qualified to handle real combat situations." It was true that Sarah's medical background had become more widely known after the incident. She had quietly helped with several more serious emergencies in town, including a car accident where her trauma training had made the difference between life and death for the victims. The community had begun to see her as someone who could be counted on in a crisis. "I never wanted to make a big deal about my military service," Sarah explained, putting the finishing touches on Rodriguez's haircut. "I came here to build a peaceful life, not to be reminded of combat every day." Rodriguez studied his reflection in the mirror, nodding approvingly at Sarah's work. "You know, Major Williams stops by the base occasionally to ask if we've heard from you. I think she's still hoping you'll reconsider her offer." Sarah had indeed been thinking about Major Williams's suggestion that she return to military service. The month since the incident had given her time to process what had happened and how she felt about using her combat skills again. The nightmares that had plagued her after her discharge had not returned, even after the intensity of the firefight at the mining complex. "I've actually been considering some options," Sarah admitted, surprising both her customers. "There are opportunities to serve without returning to full-time military duty. Medical reserve positions, training programs, consulting work that could make use of my experience." Mrs. Henderson looked concerned. "But Sarah, what about the salon? What about all of us who depend on you?" Sarah had been thinking about this question for months. The salon had been her refuge, but she was beginning to realize that hiding from her abilities wasn't the same as healing from her past experiences. The sense of purpose she had felt while saving Marcus and his team had reminded her why she had joined the military in the first place. "I'm not planning to abandon the salon," Sarah assured her. "But I'm thinking about expanding what I do, maybe training other people in basic medical skills or working part-time with military families who need support." Rodriguez finished paying for his haircut and shook Sarah's hand formally. "Whatever you decide to do, I want you to know that you gave me the chance to marry the woman I love and have the family I've always wanted. That's not something I'll ever forget." After Rodriguez left, Sarah continued working on Mrs. Henderson's hair while thinking about the conversation. The colonel's wife had become something of a confidant over the months, offering the perspective of someone who had spent decades as part of the military community. "You know, dear," Mrs. Henderson said quietly, "there's nothing wrong with using the gifts you've been given to help people. You saved those boys because you had the skills and the courage to act when they needed help. That's not something to run away from." That evening, Sarah closed the salon and drove to the beach where she often went to think. The sunset painted the ocean in shades of orange and pink, and she could see military helicopters conducting training exercises in the distance. 6 months ago, the sight of military aircraft would have triggered anxiety and memories she preferred to avoid. Now she felt a sense of connection and purpose. Sarah thought about the phone call she had received the previous week from a military family services organization. They were looking for someone with her unique combination of military experience and civilian skills to help develop support programs for veterans transitioning to civilian life. The position would allow her to keep the salon while also using her experience to help others who faced similar challenges. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Heard Rodriguez got a great haircut today. Also heard you might be considering some new opportunities. Whatever you decide, I'm proud of you for saving our lives and for building something meaningful afterwards." Sarah smiled, realizing that her brother understood what she was going through better than anyone. He had seen her at her lowest point after leaving the military, and he had also seen her rise to the occasion when lives were at stake. His support meant everything as she considered how to move forward. As the sun set over the Pacific, Sarah made her decision. She would keep the salon because it represented the peaceful life she had built and the community she had come to love. But she would also explore opportunities to use her skills in service of others, whether through military consulting, veteran support programs, or emergency medical training. The woman who had once been just a base hairdresser had discovered that she could be much more without losing the parts of herself that brought joy and stability to her life. Sometimes the most important battles weren't fought with weapons. but with the courage to embrace all of who you were meant to be. Walking back to her car, Sarah felt a sense of completeness that had been missing since her discharge from the military. She had found a way to honor both her past service and her present life, creating a future that combined the best of both worlds. Tomorrow she would call Major Williams and begin exploring how a small-town hairdresser could continue to serve her country in ways she had never imagined possible.